Don't let your dreams be dreams. Yesterday said tomorrow. So just do it. Make your dreams come true.
Hello and welcome to Screen Tones, where we talk anything and everything webcomics. Today we're going to be talking about using watercolor as a medium, its strengths for comics and illustrations, and give some of our personal recommendations. I'm Verathane. My pronouns are she, they, and I make the comics Chiralt and Witchwood.
I'm Ray. My pronouns are they, them, and I make the comics On Empyrean High and Overlord of Ravenfell.
I'm Finn. I use they them pronouns and I make the comic Heirs of the Veil.
So, to get things started on this episode, I'm going to open the floor with a very basic question, which is why watercolor? What do you like about them? Why use them?
Well, for me, my preference is I really like the transparency, which allows me the ability to build up layers and still get that luminosity of the paper that kind of still shines through. And also, there's just the feeling of randomness that you can get with watercolors that is very hard to achieve with other mediums. So, because there's just so many ways to do it. You could like wet the paper and just toss colors on and watch them bleed together, or you can mask off areas and just splatter everything and then bleed them with a spray bottle or whatever, or use salt and make fun little stars. I just like the versatility of doing paintings with the medium and still having like some sort of chaos in the process still.
Those Bob Ross happy accidents.
So many happy accidents.
Yeah, I think the versatility is also like a big factor for me because you can just do a lot with them. Depending on what kind of watercolors you choose, sometimes they can be more opaque, sometimes they can be more sheer. You can layer them, you can do whatever. There are just so many options on how to work with watercolors, which I think is very appealing. I think a lot of the times they can also be cool for mixed media stuff. And I think watercolors, when it comes to the financial part of getting into a new hobby, because there are so many like student grade watercolors out there and a lot of them can also be pretty affordable. It's also like a medium that can be very accessible, or maybe more accessible than other mediums that are more expensive to get into.
Yeah, that kind of ties into a big part of why I use watercolors personally. And I use them only in a very specific range of ways, which is I consider it my travel medium, because one of my favorite things about watercolors is how portable your entire setup can be. I have a watercolor pocket kit, which is like a little folding plastic case that has these little dried watercolor tubs inside of it, and each one has like a tiny little splash of dried watercolor paint. And the cool thing is that every time you re-wet that completely dried out little block of watercolor, you basically reawaken it, and then you can keep using that paint and mix it with new colors. So my little kit has like 24 colors in it, and it's just barely the size of my palm. And I use a pocket brush, which is it's like a pen, but it has a brush tip, and I can fill the barrel with water. And then whenever I squeeze the barrel, it comes out onto the paint, and I can just fit that in my pocket too. And if I have a little postcard size booklet of paint, or of paper, I have a little watercolor paper kit that I keep with my paints all the time. And I bring them to conventions, and I'll have them like behind my table so I can do really quick commissions on the spot. And because the watercolor kit has so many colors that can all be blended with each other, I have a full range of color to work with. It's not like markers where it's like I brought 5 markers with me and I can create these colors and basically nothing else. I can basically do anything.
It's funny you mention markers because I actually use my watercolors as a replacement for markers. My particular medium is watercolor inks, which unfortunately aren't very like travel appropriate because they're all in a bunch of little glass bottles. But the main benefit of those is once they dry, they do not budge. So I use them as a replacement for markers because I can layer a lot more than you can with markers, and you'll still have that like luminosity if you pick rather transparent colors. And I just find it to be a nice replacement, and also while there is a bit of a steep cost, it's nowhere near as pricey as having markers around.
Yeah, I think something that also made watercolors attractive to me, like traditional watercolors or watercolors that are not in ink format, is that a lot of the times, depending on the watercolors and also a little bit on the paper that you're using, you can like lift the color again, which I'm like, I make a lot of mistakes. There are like stuff that I don't like, and the possibility to just go into that again and lift the colors a little bit and then correct them is for me like a big part of the appeal, because I can just like, I mean, not endlessly because the paper will die at some point, but like for a certain amount of time you can just like correct little issues that you might have with your coloring, which I like a lot.
I just embrace the happy accidents if I make a mistake, since I get the particularly staining kind of watercolor that just doesn't budge. Even when I'm not working specifically with inks, those tend to be my preferences in the types of pigments. But those are definitely a really nice benefit to watercolors, is you can wash out your mistakes. So it's definitely something to consider.
I feel like that's where the quality of the paper becomes really, really important, though. And that unfortunately can be where the cost block is for watercolors. Because you can get like each tiny tube of liquid watercolor, like it might look expensive at first, but that tube, you can keep using it for like decades and decades, because every tiny little drop that you bring out of it, you can use to paint like 50 paintings. It goes a really long way. But the paper, to get the really nice, like the cold pressed stuff that's really, really thick and that will hold up to multiple layers and passes, especially if you're trying to work with the paint while they're still wet on the paper, that can chew through paper. Like if you ever dripped water on printer paper and seen the way it'll just start immediately tearing, like you really can't use that for watercoloring. Like you have to get something a little thicker, and that tends to be where a lot of the money goes.
I completely agree because I actually, when I first tried watercolor, I hated it. And the main reason for that being is the first watercolor pad I had was 90-pound watercolor paper, and it was just absolutely terrible. So I would say if you do want to try watercolor, start out with at least 140-pound, because it makes such a difference in just the experience. Because it's no fun just laying down one tiny wash and having your entire piece of paper just completely buckle.
Yeah, I think in that regard, there's also like something to say about the quality of like the paper in itself, not only in the thickness, but like the texture above. I don't know how to describe it, because when I started, I used fairly like thin watercolor paper, and it was like actually kind of okay. But I know that, for example, my husband at some point at the store where he worked, he like got me their watercolor paper, and it is fairly thick. But if you use a little bit too much like water, it'll just like eat through the paper, and you have these small, I don't know, small balls of paper that like just appear on the surface, which is like really not cool.
It's like it's pilling. Like an old sweater.
Yeah, right. It's like peeling, or like the paper is like peeling off at the surface, which I guess can happen with like papers of all like thickness, because this one is like they're like 300 or something, so they are pretty thick, but it has this peeling because it's cheap as fuck. And I guess if you're just starting out, that's okay, but if you want to like actually work with that, it's annoying. So I don't know, like, yeah, and that's what you said, like the price point comes probably in with the paper, because if you really want to like create something nice, you probably have to invest in like more expensive paper.
Yeah, this is where like some of this is like we had that episode on paper that we recorded for season 1 where we talked about like the sizing and stuff. There's all these different processes that go into manufacturing of paper, and with a lot of other materials, you can just kind of get away with whatever. Like markers, I have fun using markers on basically any kind of paper except for like unbelievably textured intense watercolor paper where they just skip over the surface. But with watercolor, this is where some of these things get a little more important to pay attention to. But like testing is kind of your best friend there.
Yeah, I would say my favorite thing to do to save costs for watercolor is, since I don't really work big anyway, I'll buy the really big sheets and then I'll size them down myself. I really like the fancy paper, so that also works out for me. But otherwise, paper definitely is like the one thing you cannot skimp on. You might be able to get away with it depending on how you work, but overall, I would say if you put any money into learning how to do watercolors, definitely get decent paper. Okay, so what do you think are the other challenges with working with watercolor other than paper quality?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that you mentioned that can be kind of like cool and interesting is the unpredictability of the watercolor, because a lot of the times you don't really know how the color will dry, how the pigments will move. It also kind of depends, like if you have like very highly granulated colors, you can't really be sure how they will look when they're dry and how the granulation will spread, which can like cause interesting effects, but maybe not entirely what you want. So I think one of the challenges is that you have to be okay with the colors maybe not looking quite like you imagined, or you having to like trust the process a little bit. And I think another challenge is that it can, like for me, for example, it can just get very messy, because I have my water, I have my like a brush, and I move around a lot. So I'm just like, color goes everywhere. So I think because it's like a wet medium, you will maybe accidentally cause a little bit of a mess. And it's like if you're traveling and you're using watercolor in your sketchbook, you cannot just like shut the sketchbook or something, because you have to wait for the color to dry at least a little bit so you don't cause a mess. So I think that for me is, I think, one of like the biggest challenges and one of like the biggest takebacks.
Oh man, I'm so impatient when I'm working with watercolors, and it's kind of terrible because I actually took a class in school on watercolor, and one of the things that we used were hair dryers to get layers to dry very quickly. Like we'd put down a big wash and then like use the blow dryer over it, which was great. Like if you do a lot of watercolor, I 100% recommend that. But I'm a silly person and I don't own one. And I haven't bought one, even though every time I do watercolor, I think, gosh, I wish I had one of these things. And so instead, what I do is I'll fill in an area and then I'll be like, oh, I gotta wait for this to dry. And I'll start working on something on the other side of the image so that they don't like get too close together. But then inevitably I'll forget and I'll start working on a spot right beside the area that I just worked on, which could be like, say I'm doing a character and they have a fancy jacket and the jacket has bright yellow lapels and then the outer body of the jacket is like blue. So I'll do the yellow of the lapels and then I'll start working on the blue of the jacket. And because the two are right side by side, if the yellow is still wet, and my brush just barely touches that wet yellow paint with my paintbrush, which now has blue paint on it, the blue paint is going to start bleeding right in to that yellow lapel, and it's going to look horrible because it's going to be very clear that it was not intentional. So it's kind of there's a few things that are like good to keep in mind with watercolor. One is that generally it's always better to start with light colors and work your way towards the dark colors. So if you have a picture, like just think about the areas that are going to be lighter, anything that's like a yellow or like a delicate peach or a light sky blue or something like that. Put those down first before moving on to anything dark, because if you apply a dark color first, then it's very hard to work in the opposite direction. And I get very cavalier about this because I spend so much time working digitally or with acrylics where I can cover everything up with a completely opaque medium afterwards, but that's not possible. It's the strength of watercolors is their translucency, but it also makes some things harder.
I'm going to be a chaos agent and say that I work the opposite way. I put down
Wah!
I put down my dark colors first, and I work lighter, and I usually often do a unifying color after. But as I said, I do work with watercolor inks, which you have to remember, do not budge at all once you lay them down and they dry. I will say I share the impatience though, because what I do is I will actually just lay one color down and move on to another illustration while I wait for the other to dry. For
Oh,
comics,
smart.
for comics, I often break everything up by scene because I want to have consistent colors anyway. And I'll lay down the shadows, then I'll lay down the medium hues and just continuously layer and build up my layers that way. And I'll just work scene by scene, so I'll always have each page going and then let it dry. And by the time I return to the first one, it's usually dry. So when working in comics, that's definitely a benefit if you want to keep a consistent look, is just doing it in a sort of assembly line. I will say some of the other challenges I've come across is I like using effects like salt and alcohol, and the main problem with those is they can actually ruin the paper, or also if you time them wrong, the effect will be rather understated and not very effective at all. So you really need a lot of that visual understanding of how the paper is absorbing the pigment that really just requires hands-on experimentation.
Okay, first then I want to say this is such an artist mood to be like, I want to blow dryer, not to like dry my hair, but to dry my watercolors. And now I forgot my point.
Well, I mean, I am very seriously thinking about getting a blow dryer just for my watercolors. I did
For the
I
watercolors?
did forget a point though, which is that you can't erase pencil lines if you put them down on textured watercolor paper. It's just gonna, oh, horrible.
Yeah, but it really depends. It really depends on the paper because I have like some watercolor paper, like very expensive high-end watercolor paper that's okay if the pencil is like softer. And I have like, and I don't like go into the watercolor paper like extremely, but there is a lot of watercolor paper that will just, I don't know, you just like get the top layer of the paper off. So I think that's also like you have to experiment a little bit with the paper you're using and experiment if it's safe to use like pencils on paper if you can erase it, because like Thane said, it can just like go terribly and you'll ruin your like art, which you probably don't want. But yeah, I think another thing I wanted to say is like when I work with watercolors, I'm like just super chaotic. So I basically have no rhyme or reason how I start with laying down my colors. dark, light, everything and everything next to each other because I'm also super impatient. So I guess that's great for working with watercolors for all of us. What I do, I mostly just have like paper towels, and when I notice that something like is going awry, I just like lift the color off in that area with the paper towels because I'm impatient, and it also like helps you to dry it down a little bit even though you're lifting color off. So yeah.
Yeah, it's an important part of a watercolor set is like some sort of absorbent paper towel or sponge or something for wiping, because drips will go in places.
One more challenge that I also have to mention is if you have pets. For one thing, watercolor paper is a magnet for pet hair, and this can and will affect your painting as it dries. So I will suggest getting some blue painter tape and going over your picture before you do a wash. Another problem, I don't know about the others, but this is specific to a couple of my cats, is they can and will try to drink your paint water. Do not let them drink your paint water.
It's like my first cat that I had after moving out was like a big fan of paint water, so I could not like let it stay because she would drink it. And also, like, depending on how active your cats are, my cat is like, when I use watercolors, she really loves to lie down in like my pants or run through it. So she will be covered in color, and maybe you want to avoid that because there are colors that have pigments that can be toxic to both humans and also to animals. So
This thing about the paint water is reminding me. I have painted in many places in the past. I've done life drawing sessions where I was using my watercolors, and I would have like a little can out to dip my paints in, and that can was always right beside my water glass. So unfortunately, it's really not just pets. This is a silly tip, but make sure that if you were using like a glass or a can or like a big receptacle to dip your paintbrush into as you watercolor, make sure it doesn't look at all like a drinking vessel, because they're so easy to mistake for one another. And all it takes is a split second before you realize that your mouth is full of paint water. Don't do it.
yeah, or you suddenly paint with like tea or coffee because you're dipping your brush in your beverage.
And then you can't drink
Yep.
it anymore.
That has happened more than once for me.
Uh-huh. The struggles.
Water is always more delicious when it has paint in it, especially to cats.
Delicious, delicious paint water. But yeah, talking about that, and I think we already like went into it a little bit with the sorts of paper that people should be looking for. But what would you recommend for people to look into if they want to like start out using watercolors?
Honestly, starting with like student grade materials and just seeing how they feel. If you can get your hands on better quality paints to start with, that can be nice because there are a few student grade brands out there who can be really difficult to work with. Like some paints will have a kind of weird chalky texture and stuff. Sometimes you might find that they are not enjoyable to work with, in which case it is possible that maybe it's just not like a medium that you enjoy, but also it's possible that you just need to experiment a little more and get your hands on some slightly different supplies. One nice thing about watercolors is that because so much of it is sold in those little tubes, and the tubes can basically be reused so many times. If you know someone else who has decent quality watercolor paints in the tube form, and you bring like a little tray out, they can just apply like an eyedropper sized dab of paint to your little piece of board or box or like Altoids tin or whatever, and then you can close that and take it home, and you can use that paint for like probably months afterwards. It's a very shareable medium in that regard, and it's totally possible to like check out some crazy pigments that way.
For me, I would say it's okay to use things that are cheap. Don't skip on the paper, but you don't need to buy the most expensive Arches paper ever to get anything of quality out of it. I tend to use a variety of different brands, mostly 140 pound, but sometimes heavier if I can find it for cheap. I'm willing to wait on sales, and nearly every single one of my watercolor brushes come from the clearance section. So you really don't need to spend a ton of money just to get into it. I started off with the Sakura Koi travel sets and I think just regular Canson watercolor paper. And I have prints that came out of those experimentations that still sell at my conventions that I go to this day. I will say if you want to start off with the tubes, try getting a cool blue, red, and yellow, a warm blue, red, and yellow. Doesn't matter exactly what they are, just as long as you have the warms and the cools. And then a black and a white, and that should be your starter palette. You can always borrow from friends or add to it later, but it's generally good to start out like that.
I do have one note, which is about white paint specifically, because white paint in watercolors is usually semi opaque because obviously otherwise it just wouldn't do anything, which in a lot of cases I think technically makes it a type of gouache. Gouache is like watercolor but opaque basically. And these two mediums are very like transferable to one another. Like some watercolor palettes will have both watercolor and gouache paints, which for a beginner isn't really that, like, you don't really need to worry too much about that, except to note that if you mix your white with some of your other paints, it's going to make them less transparent. So it's going to change how they layer on top of other colors from that mixed section of your palette, of course. Like you want to keep the original color kind of separated out. But once you've mixed that white with like your red or something like that, it's no longer going to look the same as just diluting that red. It'll cover up the colors underneath it in a different way.
That's true, Thane. Thank you for saying that. That does pretty much also mean that, practically speaking, for watercolors, your white usually is the paper.
Yeah, the white paint itself I usually consider a last resort, like if I'm really desperate to get more highlights or something.
Yeah, I use it for like highlight corrections or to lighten and make it more opaque usually.
Yeah, I think I use white the same, even though for a while I was like kind of mixing and matching watercolors and gouache, which can work well. And if you have like mistakes that you can't lift off, then going more opaque with the white can help. And there's also some colors, some pigments. I know that Daniel Smith, for example, also like produces more opaque watercolors, and they have a chart. I think I totally agree with Ray about the like limited palette to be like, okay, you have like a few colors that you can use and then mix, because that's the only thing you need to start out. And getting like a lot of colors in the beginning might be something that I don't know that you want. But if you really want to learn watercolors and you really want to learn to mix watercolors, it's probably best to like stay a little bit more limited. But also depending on what you want with your colors and also how long you want them to last, it might be good when you check out like brands that you want to use, how light fast the colors are, for example, because there are a few like cheaper watercolors that really will not stand any sunlight, and some other colors will be more resilient. So that depends. And it's not always like cheap watercolors. It could also be like watercolors that just have pigments that are not that sun resilient. There are like a lot of reds or pinks that kind of fade in the sun. So maybe that's also something to keep in mind, that not all colors hold up in light the same.
Yeah, I feel like this is one of those things where like it can depend a bit on what your goal is for the piece. Cause I know the thing about like the light fastness of colors, like reds can fade over time. It tends to take a while for it to happen. Like this is something that is really important if you're planning to sell your originals or that you plan to hang them and have them as like a home decor for years and years, because you might find that 3 to 5 years later, maybe sooner, maybe longer, some of the colors will start to fade and change. But if your goal is to scan it and create digital prints from it, or kind of have it as a part of your digital archive, and if you're planning on like storing it away somehow to in a way that will preserve it, then it might not really be like a huge focus. I've used a lot of mediums that are definitely not light fast at all. And I mean, it just depends on what your goals are.
Especially for comic work, which is meant to be reproduced and often, just printed in general. That's not always necessarily an end game for a lot of people. I will say one thing is definitely just experiment with materials, objects. Plastic wrap is a fun thing to put down on watercolor while it's drying. One thing that you can do, if say maybe you're just experimenting, find out you don't like it, you can still use a lot of your experiments by scanning them if you come from a digital art background. I use a lot of watercolor textures as overlays for my digital work to make a lot of the color variations look more natural. So even your experiments don't necessarily have to be a waste of paper, which was my main worry when I started watercolor.
I feel like with any traditional medium, like getting away from the idea that making art is a waste of your materials just because it's practice or it might not turn out perfect, like that can be such a big barrier to get over. And like with watercolor, as with anything else, especially when you think of a medium as being something kind of fancy, like, oh, this is quality stuff, I can't ruin it.
Yeah, if you get like really expensive materials or paper, it can be really hard to get over. But if you just be like, oh, okay, I can just use this texture to put on my next digital illustration, it does get you over that psychological hump of, oh, but it needs to be something perfect. It'll needs to be a perfect illustration, or it's just a waste of my materials.
So it's time for our last question, which is give us some recommendations for your favorite brands and watercolor products.
All right, for me, I prefer Dr. P.H. Martin's watercolor inks. They are rather pricey, but I honestly have not yet had to replace any colors, even though I'm getting low on a couple of them. For an cheaper alternative, the Blick watercolor inks I hear are really good quality and might be better for starting out. Paper wise, I tend to love Arches, but that's not always within people's price range. For comic pages, I tend to use Canson 140 pound because it's cheaper, so it's easier to get a lot of them, and they're a really nice size for doing various sizes of comics. For tube watercolors, I prefer M. Graham. They're nice because if you split them into the pan, they're mixed with honey, so it leads to them being a lot more moist for longer. They don't tend to crack like some of the drier brands, and they re-wet really nicely. They're also very smooth and buttery when you put them down. So I really highly recommend those for making pans.
Yeah, so I personally really love Van Gogh watercolors in pans or in tubes. I use the Talents. Those are like student grade watercolors, but they are like on the higher end of student grade, I would say. So they have like a really nice quality and they're really nice to use. I also use Schminke. Schminke is a little bit more on the like more expensive side, but with Schminke they sometimes release some like more experimental colors, or they have like a line of highly granulated colors that can be really cool to experiment with. But they are a little bit more expensive, and Yeah, I also a while ago got like introduced to Daniel Smith watercolors, and that through like a dot card. And dot cards are like really cool if you want to try out a brand, but you don't want to commit to buying like a full set of colors, because some brands, I know Daniel Smith does it, and I know Schminke also has some of those. It's like dot cards with like a few colors, and you can have sets with like any amount of color basically, and they put like a little bit of the tube color onto these cards and they let them dry, and then you can try them out. And I personally got like a lot of use out of the Daniel Smith dot cards. There are a few colors that I've like used a lot, and I still haven't used them all up, which I think is also pretty cool. Yeah, paper wise, I mostly use Canson paper, like 300 pounds. I sometimes use Hahnemühle, that's like a German brand, and I have no idea if, I don't know if they sell anywhere else. And for a while, I've been using the watercolor sketchbook of a brand called Arztesa. And the paper is not great, but it's pretty cheap, and for just experimenting with watercolors, it's really okay.
Yeah, it was getting watercolor kits that got me started on using watercolor at all. And I think the first one that I tried was a little Cotman folding pocket kit, which is just half of it is the pigments. I think it had 14 colors. And then the other, when you open the tin, the other half of it is your mixing surface. And it comes with a tiny little brush inside, although I always used it with a water brush from Pentel. After getting started with the Cotman, which I think it's a really good like first kit. I probably would still be using it if I hadn't later on gotten a bigger one from Van Gogh, which is now my main watercolor source. I bring it to every show and whenever I travel, along with a little pad of postcard sized watercolor paper from Strathmore. It's 140-pound paper, and the sheets are cut 4 by 6 inches. So they're all kind of already made in the right size, and I can just create cool pictures on them and then take them out of the little booklet and make a new one until I use it up. I think I've bought like 10 of these now because I keep using them. I think that's basically my predominantly used watercolor stuff, but sometimes occasionally I'll get the urge to do like a bigger piece. And I also have a large pad of Canson watercolor paper and a medium-sized pad of Arches paper, which is a block, which a watercolor block is where the paper, usually a very heavy textured paper, is kind of bound around the edges of it with a kind of adhesive, so that when people paint on it, if they use a lot of water on it, the surface of it will try to buckle, but it's held in place at the edges by the adhesive. So you can use it as if it's been stretched flat. And then as soon as it dries, you remove it from the block and you kind of have to cut all the way around the outside of the sheet of paper. And they're kind of fun to use, but they do tend to be very expensive. So I use that paper occasionally, and then I have some Winsor and Newton brushes that I'll use, and I have tubes of Sennelier watercolor paint that are literally decades old. They were my grandmother's. This is how long these things last. Is that this paint, like literally, it will keep going forever, these little tubes. And I think that is basically all of my supplies. I've had a lot of fun using them, and I also enjoy basically all the other stuff I've experimented with. It's funny that the dot cards were mentioned because I received one for the first time very recently that I haven't tried out yet. It's from a company called Beam Paints. They're based out of Manitoulin, and they use all these traditional First Nations techniques and materials to get the pigments, and they have shell colors and metallics and stuff like that. So I'm very excited to try out some of these new pigments.
Yeah, I think if you really want to go into watercolors and you do not know where to start or how to train techniques or whatever, YouTube is, of course, a very good resource. Just like looking for watercolor tutorials, you will find all kinds of tutorials. There are a lot of creators who do that stuff, who will explain step by step how you can approach something. I found like a lot of great resources, especially when it comes to like mixing skin colors, especially darker skin colors, something like that. So if you want to start, I think YouTube is a good place for that.
There's plenty of books out there too. Like I love Stephanie Puyaman Law's ones because they're very illustration focused.
Yeah, it's great getting like access to visual resources like that because I mean, it is extremely fun talking about it on a podcast, but in terms of getting into the details of techniques, you definitely need like visuals to see what the colors are doing. And there's no substitute for getting your hands on it and experimenting in person. So anyway, I think that is a roasted red pepper and goat cheese wrap. And yeah, this has been our episode on watercolors. I have been Verathane, and you can find my comics at tiralt.sevensmith.net and at witchwoodcomic.com.
And I am Ray, and you can find my comic on Empyrean High at empyreancomic.com and Overlord of Ravenfell on Webtoon.
And I've been Finn, and you can find my webcomic at heirsoftheveil.com.
And yeah, woohoo!
Yeah. And now I want to use watercolors. I noticed that I need to get my tubes and squeeze a little bit more in my pans because some colors are running low.
Yes, so satisfying too.
Thanks for listening to Screen Tones. Subscribe to us on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts to be notified of new episodes. And be sure to follow us on Twitter at ScreenTonesCast.